Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today I wanted to take some time to break down some ideas I have for adaptations, following the recent news from Warner Brothers a few weeks ago that there are more Lord of the Rings movies coming. For more details on that specific announcement, check out my video discussing that in the description and cards. Also, if any people from Warner Brothers or anywhere else are watching, welcome, and please feel free to use any of these adaptation ideas or concepts from this video. All I want is good Middle-earth adaptations at this point. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Before we get into the list properly, I have to qualify how I made these decisions. At the moment, in 2023, the Silmarillion adaptation rights are impossible to get. Warner Brothers seems to have access to The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and the appendices of The Lord of the Rings still. Thus, these ideas are all concepts from the Third Age of Middle-earth, and should aptly fit into their available rights. Originally, this video consisted of the top 5 stories that I thought they could use, but I actually think there are 10 really solid ones we may talk about, if not more. Really, this video is slanted towards those new movie adaptations, but honestly, these ideas may go towards any company with those rights. But I have made a video on how I myself would do a Second Age TV show theoretically, and I plan to make more similar videos about other age-long TV shows as well. The following list is only in an order that generally follows the chronology of the Third Age from earlier to later, but they are just ideas that I think would be neat to explore in this format. Finally, while any of these stories offer great ideas to adapt, they require respect and dedication on behalf of the movie makers to do them right. Otherwise, such adaptations would be pointless and would likely fail, as they would not capture the heart and themes of Tolkien's works. Now, let's get into it. Number 1. The Gondorian Civil War. Many of my suggestions are in some ways related to wars throughout the Third Age, which is certainly a reoccurring thing that happens within Tolkien's works. But the movie creators would need to take heed to focus more on the characters and quests involved in the stories, rather than the wars themselves. The Gondorian Civil War would be an interesting and probably complex movie adaptation to make. It would have to be a personal, political drama almost, with focus on the politics of Gondor and the different factions therein. This has such an interesting story, as we would follow the civil war that broke out over the succession of the throne by someone with mixed Númenórean and Rovanian blood, betrayed by his distant relative Castamir, leading to much death and kin-strife in the kingdom, including the destruction of much of Osgiliath, the loss of a Palantir, an epic river battle at the crossings of Irui, and a personal duel between our hero and the villain, though much was lost in this civil war. The main characters for good would be Valakar of Gondor, his wife Vidumavi of Rovanion, their son and heir, the main character Eldakar, and his children, and the antagonists Castamir and his sons. This would be an incredible, almost historic, very complex piece of art. Number 2. The Fall of Moria. Another idea for a really unique and interesting adaptation would be this, the Fall of Moria. Since this is a rather large and important event in the history of Middle-earth, but it does not have much explicit information about it, this adaptation actually leaves a lot of room for interpretation and creativity on behalf of the movie makers. This story would definitely end in a dark way with the exile of the dwarves, but perhaps with their migration to Erebor it could end with a bit of hope instead. The main characters would likely be Durin VI, Nain I, and Thrain I, and any other associated dwarves needed to flesh out the story, while the main antagonist would of course be Durin's Bane, and the story would be of the fall of Moria to the Balrog, and the exile of the dwarves because of the Balrog. The Lord of the Rings Online tells this tale in a quest that puts you back in time playing as a dwarf during the fall, and it could be a really interesting event to witness, the uncovering of a sleeping Balrog. The fun part of this story is the major event, and all of the people that were affected by it, but it could offer a nice foundation for a story that would have importance in the main events of The Lord of the Rings, while offering enough creative room for some world building from a few dedicated writers who could build this story into something memorable and very special. Number 3. Wainrider War. This war would see Gondor nearly collapse, but it would perhaps show the strength of the Men of the West best out of all of these films. Ultimately, the plot would show how the Easterlings developed new technology, the Wain or battle chariot, and the tactics that they would use to defeat Gondor on the field of battle near Mordor and northeast Ithilien. The film would focus on King Anduhir and his close family, including his heirs and daughter Firiel, whom would marry Arvedwi, which would be a neat tie-in to the Angmar War, and their close allies among the Eotheid. More complexity and depth could be added to the Wainrider Easterlings, perhaps showing a servant of Sauron that was directly influenced by the Dark Lord, leading this army. It would show the story of how Faramir, the heir who was meant to stay in Minas Tirith, rode forth to battle anyway, and died, and the darkening of hope until finally the Gondorians out of the south, led by Eorl II, the future king, surprised and destroyed this enemy. It would likely be a pretty war-heavy movie, but it could offer some really interesting looks into the humanity of people during war, and how a kingdom tries to unite when it has every external reason to fall apart. Number 4. The Angmar War. While every idea on this list is something that I think could be adapted well, this is perhaps my favorite and top choice for an adaptation, as I've seen a version of the story done in the game Battle for Middle-earth 2: Rise of the Witch King, and I've seen much of the remnants of the lore in the late Third Age of this done in the game The Lord of the Rings Online. This story is full of the themes of mankind, the rise and fall of a great civilization, plagued by civil strife, internal and external conflict, plague, desperate hope, alliance, the struggle to survive, and much more. The largest issue with this idea is the amount of time that this war took place over, and adapting that would be rather difficult, as it would likely need some sort of time compression or flashback scenes or multiple movies to really flesh out the context and story of the war fully. But really, the main plot would likely be the last few decades of this war, as Arthedain took its last stand at Fornost in the north, reinforced its alliance with Gondor in the south, who came to their aid with the elves too late for the kingdom. Then we would follow the end of the North Kingdom and the rise of the Dunedain Rangers, the death of Arvedui, last king in Forokel, and the ascension of his son Aranarth, the first chieftain of the Dunedain Rangers. The main characters for this story would be Arvedui, Aranarth, Earnur, Glorfindel, Círdan, and Elrond, while the main antagonists would be the Witch King and his servants. This would be an incredible tale that could follow specific characters while outlining the war and world-changing events at large, showing things like the ruin of Weathertop, the fall of Fornost, and the destruction of Carn Dûm, amongst many other things. There is so much potential here, all of which is outlined in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. Number 5. The Oath of Eorl and Cirion, and the Founding of Rohan. This story would be a classic, setting up the oath that we see fulfilled in the ride of the Rohirrim in Gondor during The Lord of the Rings. Mostly, this would probably be a character piece, focusing on Eorl becoming king and taming the first of the Marras in northern Rovanion, and Cirion in Gondor, trying to defend his people, as the Easterlings closed in on Gondor, and then Gondor sending word for aid to their friends in the north, a message that hardly made it there. It would then follow the difficult journey of the Eotheid near Lorien and Dol Guldur, protected by the magic of Galadriel, and their coming to the field of Celebrant in the hour of Gondor's need, leading them to defeating the Easterlings and securing the land of Rohan as a gift from Gondor. Again, it would likely be a character story with a fairly good amount of action, and the focus would generally be on the main characters of Eorl the Young, his close family and friends, Cirion the Steward of Gondor, and any major main enemy that the movie makers could create on the side of the Easterlings. Now, the biggest difficulty with adapting this story is that much information about this event is also in the Unfinished Tales, not just the appendices, so likely not all of it could be adapted. Number 6. War of the Dwarves and Dragons. Next, we have a rather broad and encompassed idea. This would be an adaptation that the creators could really make their own, as we really don't have much source material to go off of at all. Before Smaug ever attacked, there were centuries when the dwarves tried to settle the Grey Mountains, and even left Erebor behind for the most part, for the distant northern mountain range. But eventually they were driven out by the dragons of the north, which saw many of their people slain and homes taken or destroyed. Perhaps this was even part of the reason that Smaug would later attack them at Erebor, who knows? The main characters would likely be the dwarves in the late part of the war, Nain II, Dain I his son, and Fror, Gror, and Thror, who would eventually be king, Nain's grandsons, while the creators could have a fun time coming up with the main antagonists amongst the dragons. This would be a wild adaptation, and depending on the story written for it, could be really an amazing fantasy movie. Number 7. The War of the Dwarves and Orcs. This story would be one of, if not the most epic adaptations on this list, as it would follow the dwarves that were exiled from Erebor as they lived in Dunland, and after they were wronged, when King Thror was slain and mutilated by Azog, the chieftain of the Orcs of Moria, and all 7 clans of the dwarves declared war on the Orcs. Now, the Hobbit films certainly incorporated some of this lore in their own story, but I think this adaptation would offer a far more fleshed out and interesting look at the whole conflict. Again, since this was a rather massive and large-scale war spanning years and across different dwarven strongholds such as Moria and Gundabad, I would focus the film on its main characters and their narrative arcs, who would likely be King Thrain, Prince Thorin Oakenshield, Thane Ironfoot, his father Nain, and their strife against Azog and perhaps even Bolg, to add more villainous characters to it. The scale of the conflict would be grand, but personal tales of vengeance, justice, victory, and defeat would be incredible to see adapted. Number 8, Helm Hammerhand and the Dunlending War. This is likely going to be the story that we get in the War of the Rohirrim anime next year or so I won't cover it much. But the story of Helm Hammerhand, his conflict with the Dunlendings, his death during the long winter outside of the Hornburg, and the ride of his nephew to reclaim Rohan would be a fantastic and archetypally compelling story to adapt on the big screen. The main characters would be Helm Hammerhand, his daughter and sons, his nephew and avenger Freyolaf Hildeson, and their enemies Freka and his son Wolf. I'm excited to see this unfold in the War of the Rohirrim, and believe that it is a rather perfect story to adapt from the source material. Number 9, the defense of the North during the War of the Ring. This would perhaps be one of the safest starting options for a new Lord of the Rings series of adaptations, and it is another one that I've seen in Battle for Middle-earth 2. The best part of this adaptation, especially if it were made by Warner Brothers, is that it would be a bit of an extra movie for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Perhaps something to watch between the Two Towers and The Return of the King to emphasize the greater importance of events of the War of the Ring as they took place in the north, while the Battle of Minas Tirith and the Battle of the Black Gate were fought in the south, or even to splice that and The Return of the King together in some interesting way would be pretty cool. The main events would be the unity of the Elven, Dwarven, and Mannish strongholds in the north during their respective battles against Easterlings and the Orcs of Dol Guldur and those from the Misty Mountains, likely ending with the destruction of Dol Guldur and the new division of Mirkwood as the Greenwood, as well as the rebuilding of Dale and Erebor. Likely a few adaptation changes would have to be made to tie the story together a bit more, like the choices made in the Battle for Middle-earth 2 version, because our main characters for the side of good would be rather spread out, as they would be Dane Ironfoot and his son Thorin Stonehelm, Brand and his son Bard, Thranduil, Celeborn and Galadriel, with some room for some original screenplay villains for their own factions. It would be a really great tie-in to our former Lord of the Rings movies. Number 10. The Tale of Aragorn and Arwen. Finally, concerning the story that I originally thought was going to be Amazon's Lord of the Rings show, back when it was announced in late 2017, I've come around to the idea that, if done properly, the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, their backgrounds and love story, would actually be rather incredible. From the two of them meeting in Rivendell, to Aragorn going on his quest as Thorongil, and so forth, to become the hardiest man alive, to their engagement in Lothlorien and their time as rulers and their deaths would be beautiful, tragic, and inspirational. The only awkward part of the narrative structure would be the tale of the Lord of the Rings right in the middle of it, but if the movie maker found an intriguing way to bridge that gap without retelling the story over much, this would be a rather unique and intriguing love story set in fantasy, which tells so much about humanity, love and joy, and death and grief. It would be especially incredible to see Viggo Mortensen and Liv Tyler reprise their roles while playing the older versions of their characters after the war. The main characters would certainly be Aragorn and Arwen, with the shadow of mortality and Sauron's evils being the chief antagonists of the story. This would be a difficult tale to depict correctly, it is true, but it would be very amazing if done well. And there we have it. Those are my top 10 choices for adaptations of Tolkien's stories, for any with the rights to them to consider making. Again, it is certainly about quality more than anything, and the honoring of Tolkien's works. These stories would be available to any with the rights to the appendices, but it would require true love of Tolkien's works to adapt them well, and that is not something that can be bought, but procured through hours of time spent in Middle-earth, and through the exploration of its many stories, settings, and characters. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on these stories for adaptation? Would they work, or am I missing any? Let me know in the comments below. There are certainly other, smaller stories that could be adapted, as many short fan films have proven, but I think these are the main ones that I would recommend for adaptations. If you would like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythology Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch and Patreon. Thanks to our Valor Tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Molly Sullivan, Blair Scouten Merton, John Hume, Sam McBee, Matt Sabach, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Adam Petrolik, Anthony Dorwin Gray, Arthur, Merlin, Dale Davis, Kingswald Project, and Robert Bogue, our newest Valor Tier patron. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I'll see you all again next Sunday with a video on why Gil-galad was the last High King of the Elves. You all are the best, my friends. Thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.